step into Fritz's presentation. Fritz, and I'm going to try to pronounce your last name, Hoogakker.
Pretty close.
Okay. Okay, Fritz is a fisheries biologist with Dominion. He has background in fish passage, other species. He's worked along the Eastern Seaboard in different capacity. He went to school in Tennessee.
Yep, undergrad at
Virginia and Tennessee.
Undergrad at Richmond, master's in Tennessee.
Okay. And let's see, what else do I have here? Been with Dominion 3 years.
About that.
So he's got a good background in this subject, so we look forward to hearing what he has to say. I will say this real quick. It was a few years ago, and I went down to a boat landing, putting in the boat, and I saw a sign that was posted, and it said, "Have you seen one of these critters?" And it was a picture of an eel. And I was like, what is that? You know, is that a fish? Is that a snake? What kind of critter is that? So that kind of piqued my interest. On several times and meetings, Corey has spoken about some of the work that Dominion's done on eel passage. But this will be a chance for us to hear from a biologist who's not just seen it from afar, but has had his hands deep in it. So with that, Fritz.
Thank you, Jeff. First of all, sorry for running a little late this morning, holding things up. Got waylaid by a road closing on the way down here, so I'm sorry for holding up the proceedings. As Jeff said, I'm Fritz Hoogakker. I'm a fish biologist with Dominion. There's a few of us that we all work kind of across the breadth of the company. But about 2 months ago, I took over management of Rapids and Gaston from Ben Eberlein, so I'm pretty new. I'm learning a lot really quickly, and I'm super excited to be here. I'm really excited about a lot of the work we're doing down here. As Jeff mentioned, I've got a pretty broad background in fisheries biology, everything from, I was a commercial salmon fisherman in Alaska, worked in commercial fisheries in the Northeast, and tribal subsistence fisheries in the Amazon and everything in between. So it's got a little bit of a background to draw on, but learning a lot here, and then I spent about 6 years with Virginia DWR before coming to Dominion. So an overview, most of you probably know a lot about this already. This is a little bit of what we're going to talk about today. So provide a little history on the project, both Roanoke Rapids and Gaston. Definitely get into our eel passage, as that's kind of the bulk of our biologicals activities. The 3 phases we're going through that with our relicensing, as well as some of our other projects that are required. There's some of the bypass reach monitoring at Roanoke Rapids, some basic population monitoring, as well as our grass carp stocking in Lake Gaston. So getting to the part where you guys are probably most familiar. We're licensed under FERC, as pretty much all energy projects are. Both of the dams, Roanoke Rapids and Gaston, are covered under one license in this agreement. Roanoke Rapids is the first dam on the Roanoke system, about 137 miles upstream from Albemarle Sound and 186 from Oregon Inlet. These numbers will become a little more relevant as we start talking about the eel life cycles, and you'll see how important it is and how impressive it is that the eels are getting to where they're getting. Gaston Dam is about 7 miles upstream from Roanoke Rapids, is the second dam in the system, and that is followed by Care Dam, which is an Army Corps dam, but is important because it plays a lot into our biological operations and is the next barrier to fish passage in the system above our projects. So Roanoke Rapids, as I mentioned, the lowest dam on the system, constructed in the mid-50s, as well as began operation, a little over 3,000 feet long, but that creates a reservoir of 4,600 acres and holds, give or take, 21.5 billion gallons of water at any given time. We operate 4 turbines there, or up to 4 turbines. Most of the time they won't all be running unless we got a great deal of water to work with. And it is 72 feet tall, so as you can imagine, holds back a pretty good amount of water, but not quite as much as Gaston. That brings us to Gaston, constructed about 8 years later, a little bit longer, still on that 3,000 to 4,000 foot range. Holds back a 20,000 acre reservoir that holds about 120 billion gallons of water, so quite a bit, I think it's fair to say. Also 4 turbines and 107 feet tall. So like all energy projects, our license comes in terms, depending on the project, it may be, anywhere from just a few years to a much longer period of time. Corey, correct me if I'm wrong, but we're on a 50-year license, is that correct? 40-year license. So our current license was issued in 2005, and every time that cycle comes around, there's a kind of everybody gets a new bite at the apple as far as what changes need to be made to that license, so that changes in regulations can occur at that time. From our perspective, that obviously, from what I do, we're mainly concerned with the biological aspects. That's administered by a number of agencies, but particularly NOAA, NIMS, National Marine Fisheries Society, Fish and Wildlife Service, as well as the state wildlife agencies. So during that relicensing period, it came about that we knew that there are a lot of diadromous fish, particularly eels, coming at these dams, and the agencies would like to see fish passage for them. We'll get to that in a second, why fish passage is important for these critters. And as a result of that, we formed a technical advisory committee, the Diadromous Fish Restoration Technical Advisory Committee. It's a mouthful. We call it the DIFRTAC, which is still kind of a mouthful, but at least it's a little shorter. And that consists of a number of agencies, academic institutions, as well as Dominion Energy. And that's the governing body for how we implement basically all biological aspects, but especially fish passage at our dams. So basically it consists of a number of stakeholders. We'll get to that in a second. I'll get in a little more detail. But as a result of that relicensing project, that group decided that we should install fish passage, specifically eel passage, at both of those dams to allow eels to both get upstream of the dams, make sure they're distributing through both reservoirs, and then later in their life cycle, get back downstream of those dams with minimal mortality. So it also requires a few other biological aspects. We do a lot of monitoring and management of freshwater mussels, anadromous migratory fish, and resident fish in the bypass reach right downstream of Roanoke Rapids Dam, making sure we're keeping those populations healthy and stable. Next slide, please. So getting into a little bit more about the DIFRTAC, this is the group that basically administers and advises everything we do biologically at Roanoke Rapids and Gaston. No need to go through the whole list, but as you can see, it's a combination of academic institutions, federal agencies, and state agencies, basically bringing together all of the folks responsible for management of fisheries resources in this area. In this case, since eels have a life cycle, or migratory and have an ocean-based life cycle, they're especially, they're administered by federal agencies more than a traditional, resident largemouth bass or something would be, who would be usually managed specifically by the state. But because this is a migratory and oceanic resource, there's a number of different agencies that come into play. Next slide, please. So we'll get a little bit into some fish biology here, just to give you a background of the project. There's a whole group of different fishes known as diadromous. Basically, diadromous means that these organisms make a migration of some sort, spend part of their life cycle in the sea, part of their life cycle in freshwater. So you're probably all fairly familiar with how salmon migrate, live most of their lives in the ocean, come up the rivers to spawn, and in their case die. But there's a number of different fish that have what we call this anadromous life cycle. That specific process and order of operations is referred to as anadromy. A lot of you are probably familiar with American and hickory shad that we have here. They do the same thing, as well as blueback herring and alewife. A group of, mostly what we're concerned with here is a group of fishes known as alocines. Striped bass are also partly anadromous, so we deal with them quite a bit as well. But similar to salmon, the bulk of their life cycle is out in the ocean. That's where they grow, where they mature. They come back up the rivers to spawn. Unlike salmon, at least in these populations, these fish will survive, so they out-migrate and will return for multiple spawns over the course of their lifetime. Some of the shad populations a little further south only do it once, but we're far enough north that the energetic expense is not great enough. They can complete the cycle multiple times. But there's a different kind of diadromy that's specifically a lot more rare, and that's where the eels come in. Eels are what we refer to as catadromous, which means they do the reverse of what the salmon and the shad and the herring do. So the eels will spend most of their lifetime in lakes and rivers and streams. They're really generalist in what habitats they prefer, but it'll definitely be freshwater. And it could be anywhere from Lake Gaston to big tidal rivers to brook trout streams in the mountains. They're really excellent at finding their way upstream past barriers to get where they need to be. And then they spend that phase of their life is what's called yellow eels. These are the eels you've probably seen before, the ones we most commonly encounter. When they're ready to spawn, they will transform into what's called a silver eel. Their coloration will change, as the name would imply. They get much more silvery, their eyes enlarge a great deal. And that's kind of what's going to trigger their out migration. And they're going to migrate all the way back down the rivers they came up when they were, juveniles, to the sea. And they're going to travel out to the Sargasso Sea, which is off the Caribbean a little bit. And that's where they'll spawn. Still relatively little is known about this process. They're super hard to study creatures. As soon as they get out to the open water, they go down to about 2,000 feet and swim there, presumably just to avoid us finding them. So it's only fairly recent that we've really had a good understanding of this whole life cycle. But once they reach the Sargasso Sea, that's where they'll spawn. They are similar to salmon, in which case after they'll spawn, they'll die. But when that happens, there's a huge mass of eggs out there that will hatch in that area. When they hatch, they're what's called leptocephali, which is basically a larval eel. They're almost like little transparent ribbons. They don't look like anything that we would consider an eel or anything like it. They almost look like an invertebrate or something more than a fish. But they'll be like that for a few weeks, and then they'll transform into their next stage of their life cycle, elvers, which much more resemble what we would think of when we think of an American eel, just very much smaller. And at this stage is when they'll kind of start migrating back to the east coast of the United States. They'll ride the current all the way up the coast. And whenever they sense the water that somehow, we don't really know, of the same rivers that their parents came from, they'll take a hard left and swim up that river, Not with perfect accuracy, but pretty remarkably close. Wow. They'll travel up that river until they find a place they think is suitable, and they'll just hang out there and mature and grow until they're ready to out-migrate. So it's a really interesting life cycle, kind of the converse to a lot of the other fish migrations we see. And as a result, it's kind of different to manage than it would be for an Holocene or an anadromous fish. I guess I could have had this slide up while I was describing that whole cycle. That probably wouldn't have been helpful. But there it is, again. So you can go ahead. So for eel passage, a little hard to see up here, so I'll go through it kind of fast, but that's just showing our two dams, kind of how they occur back to back, and you can advance it. And this is showing Roanoke Rapids Dam. I don't know how well you can see the yellow dots there. You're fine, don't worry about it. But we have 3 eelways there. This is 2 of them. The north and south eelway. We also have one on the tail race. So basically kind of coverage across the river, specifically in spots with high flow. Because when eels are finding their way back upstream, that flow is what they're going to follow to navigate that process. They're always going to try because that's what they know, there's water. If there's flow, there's water coming through, they know they can probably find their way up that. As you can see here, there's kind of long diagonal structures. Those are our eel ramps. So eels are really, really good at climbing structures. They still can't quite climb a 70-foot concrete dam, right? So we give them a little help as part of the fishway prescription or regulations to get them upstream. We use these. So these are, as you can see, ramps. I'm going to go to the next slide. And this is what they look like inside. There's a trickle of water coming down them with a number of basically small PVC plugs, in essence, that allows them to get some traction and crawl up it. And there's enough water coming down it to allow them to climb. In addition to, we provide what's called an attraction flow at the bottom, which provides flow just at the base of it to get them, to cue them in to come to that place to get up the dam, right? So these ramps don't go all the way up the dam. As you can see on the right there, they actually end in kind of a holding pad. That is basically because it would be pretty hard for us to get them all the way over the dam, just the way it works. But also that allows us the opportunity to collect data on them, to know how many we're passing, to tag them in a lot of situations. It gives us a lot more information about how well we're doing and how many eels we're getting over that dam on a day-to-day basis. So they fall into holding pens like that on the right, and 3 times a week during the season, which goes from about March to November, usually it's sometimes a little longer. We will go collect them 3 times a week. We'll put them in a live well and we'll truck them to the other side of the dam and dump them in the lake. So this is occurring both at Roanoke Rapids and Gaston. Go to the next slide. This is Gaston. It's showing our eelways there. Gaston, we have 2 eelways, one on the north side, one on the south side. Corey, correct me if I'm wrong. I think that north dot may have actually changed. But
it's essentially in the same direction.
Yeah. But the point remains, we have one on the south side of the river, one on the north, similarly to the 2 places where we have substantial flow coming through and operate in the same way. These are the 2 Gaston eel ramps. You can see they're pretty similar to the ones at Roanoke Rapids. The one we have goes directly into our workup shed, which is really nice. You just walk in there, open the chest, and at times several thousand eels waiting for you. So historically we've tagged at both dams. Currently we're tagging at Gaston Dam. If you can go to the next slide. Yeah, there's a bunch of eels. Imagine that. So we use what are called coated wire tags. So it's actually a tiny little piece of wire, less than 1 millimeter long, that has a very small code imprinted on it. So we implant these in the kind of the spinal musculature of the eel, so in the muscles around the spine. It's very small, doesn't bother them at all, doesn't hinder them at all. And that allows us that if we ever recapture eels up the lake, we can keep them. Unfortunately, to find these tags, we do have to kill the eel and dissect them, but we can remove the tag. And that allows us to see, because we have a record of what numbers went in when. So we know when we stocked that eel, when it was moving, how long it's been in the lake, so on and so forth. That allows us to do a lot of keeping track of, once again, how well we're doing, and specifically where the eels we put in are going. Are they, once we get them past the dam, do they want to be up there? Are they distributing through the lake? Are they continuing to move upstream? So at Roanoke Rapids, all the eels we collect are released at the 5th Street ramp. In the past, we had released them kind of at some different stations throughout the lake in hopes that we could see where they wanted to be and if they were distributing better. What we found is they distribute great no matter where we put them. So now they all go in at 5th Street and they've been doing great. At Gaston, all the eels are released at the day use area right by the dam. And as I said before, these are the juvenile eels. They're a little past that elver stage, but they're still very much juvenile. They're usually in the neighborhood of 200 millimeters or right in there somewhere. Next slide, please. So here's some of the numbers we've been looking at. You can see on the right, big numbers, right? That's this year. We're really excited about this. The Gaston this year passed, approximately 4 times as many eels as it ever has before. We are thrilled about this. We don't really know why yet. We're hoping that maybe they've reached saturation point. We've passed enough eels upstream of Roanoke Rapids that they've distributed throughout the lake. That habitat's kind of taken, so they're moving on through the system, trying to get up to Gaston, right? It'll be really interesting to see how many we pass next year, because that'll give us an idea of, is that what's going on, or did environmental cues just make for a really good eel year, But regardless, really exciting to see those numbers come up in that kind of explosive manner. Roanoke Rapids, not quite as dramatic, but we also had a record year there. So whichever way you slice it, there's a lot of eels moving through the system. There's definitely a demand for the habitat we're providing them. They're doing everything they can to get there, which is pretty cool to see. Next slide. So this kind of shows you when the eels are moving. What you have on the x-axis at the bottom is just the month and the number of eels total we've moved in that month. So basically what this is showing is that at both dams we see, that they're moving a little bit through the whole season, but definitely peaking in spring and fall. That's due to a number of environmental cues, largely flow and temperature are the 2 cues that really they feel and they're like, okay, it's time to move, Next slide. So for distribution, so that kind of covers what we've done to get them upstream, which is which was the kind of the first stage of our project and a big one. But now that we've got them upstream into this lake, so we need to know where they're going. Are they distributing throughout both lakes? Are they moving upstream? Are they falling back downstream? So we've accomplished this a few different ways. We've just wrapped up our distribution studies at Roanoke Rapids. We used a combination of boat-based electrofishing, which some of you are familiar with. It runs an electric current through the water, stuns fish in general. And then we can net them up, collect them, look for tags, whatever we may do. We can detect if an eel has a tag without killing it, so we'll scan them to check if it has a tag. If they are tagged, we'll retain them and then check that tag for when it came from. We also did a number of backpack electrofishing surveys, which is the same thing, just with a Ghostbusters type unit on your back and wading up a stream with, cottonmouths here and here the whole time. So that's great. But with both of those in conjunction with a lot of eel potting, so we also do randomized sets throughout the lake, or did I should say. So basically every time we'd set them out, which was throughout the summer, you'd have a new randomized set of coordinates designed to spatially cover the entire lake, record our catches, and make sure that the eels were getting everywhere, and also determine if they're not moving everywhere, where are they moving, and what are those habitat types. So we determined is they certainly do have habitat types they prefer, kind of what you'd expect for eels, shallow, vegetated, muddy areas. Deeper areas as well, but not the super deep areas. But they are distributing to these habitats throughout the lake, so they are using the lake in its entirety. And throughout all that, distribution looks good. Wrapped that up last year. We know they're throughout the lake. We know they're making it to Gaston Dam, and we know that they're passing Gaston as well. At Gaston, we're in the early phases of our distribution study there, trying to look at all the same stuff. So we're taking, at this moment, a little bit looser approach to try to really get a feel before we hone in on exactly standardized sites. So we're doing a lot of boat electrofishing, but still very exploratory. So basically we're just starting from the top of the lake, because if we find eels at the top of the lake, that answers a lot of questions for us right away. And just looking for what we now know to be the habitat they prefer, doing long transects there, looking for those eels. In addition, the NCEDNR is helping us a ton. As you guys may know, they have a lot of standardized monitoring for game fish they do in the lake. So they've agreed to help us out, and whenever they find eels, they'll check them for a tag, and if it has a tag, they'll bring it to us so we can, so that gives us a ton of great coverage, and saves us a lot of work, which is really, really nice. And through that sampling, and last year we found an eel in Songbird Creek in Gaston, which you guys probably know is a good ways up the lake. So preliminary, one eel doesn't mean a whole lot, but it's very cool to find that we know they're getting someplace. At least one eel made it a fair way up the lake. So while it's certainly not the end all be all, it's very encouraging, and we're excited about it. Gaston did not conclude in 2024, so ignore that bullet. I don't know why that's there, where that is an ongoing process. So what do we do after we demonstrate distribution? As you may recall from the eel life cycle part of the presentation, eels also have to get back out to the sea safely, right? Navigating hydroelectric dams, you can imagine there can be some challenges there, right? So as much as work as we've done to get eels upstream, we're now starting to look at the dams downstream, mostly because we've started passing eels long enough ago around Roanoke Rapids that some of those are hitting that maturity part of their life cycle where they're ready to go back downstream. So we're still exploring exactly what the best way to do that is. We did a big acoustic tagging study. This is actually surgically implanting a number of adult eels with what we call acoustic transmitters. They give off a coded pulse in a very specific sequence, almost like a sonar unit or something like that. And we have receivers stationed in the lake and below the dams that if those eels come close to it or pass it, it'll pick up that signal from the surgically implanted tag. We can use these to kind of examine when the eels are moving and what cues are triggering that downstream migration, right? Is it flow? Is it temperature? The answer is yes to both of those, maybe some other stuff as well. But that was able to give us a really good look at the time of year we need to focus on providing these eels safe downstream passage. So we're still looking at a lot of different technologies to do that, investigating, could be anything from turbine designs to nightly shutdowns or any other technology. We're currently working really closely with our advisory committee to figure out what the best way to achieve that is. But look forward to figuring that out in the next year or two. So that I'll pause really briefly there. That kind of sums up the eel passage portion of the talk. Does anybody have any questions about that before we go on? Yeah, yes sir.
So I imagine eels are making it downstream somehow, despite what you're doing.
Some absolutely are.
So how, you just open the dam and you hope?
Yeah, through the spillway. Some pass through the turbines. Not all of them make it through the turbines, but a larger portion than you might think do. But basically what the different tagging we would like to see is to get those survival numbers up from where they currently are. Yes, sir.
How big do these things get?
They can get pretty substantial, I don't know. I've personally seen them up to 3.5, 4 feet long in certain situations. I haven't seen those eels here, but they do exist.
My wife's definitely done swimming.
Frankly, you might catch one fishing, but they're not something they're very secretive animals. You're unlikely to encounter one, they're certainly not going to bite you or anything like that. Yes, sir.
How long is the life cycle?
It can actually vary, depending on the population, depends when they make that out migration to spawn. So it's interesting, it's the same in a lot of fishes, the colder the water in the system, the longer they'll take to reach that maturity point. I actually don't have a good answer for you off the top of my head about what these eels do. I'm still learning that, and that's not something I've encountered yet. But feel free to follow up with me. I'll give you my email. I can get you an answer to that for sure. We do have that information. Yes, sir.
What are the main predators for the eels?
Everything likes to eat eels. If it's big enough to fit in its mouth, they're great. Everything from here, blue catfish, love them. Striper, love them. But anything they'll find them will eat
I'm part
them.
of the striper group, and yeah, they fish with eels.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, that's part of the reason we're tagging, right? There's eels in the reservoir already. We don't know how they got there, but we think it's probably striper guys, letting eels go after they're done fishing with them. So the tagging helps us differentiate those eels from ones we pass as well.
Yeah, and blue cats, when you clean them, you find mussels and eels.
Yeah, that ain't much a blue cat won't eat.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Is there a plan to add card to the project as well, currently?
I haven't heard anything about that. The Corps operates under very different kind of rules and regulations than we do, so I can't speak to what their plan is. I haven't heard any news about fish passage there, but I really can't speak to it. Yes, sir.
So if you're moving all the eels and dropping them in one place, do you see a lot of increased predation where the fish are sitting there waiting for them to be dumped in?
We haven't observed that to date. That doesn't mean it doesn't happen offshore a little bit, but we have no information to suggest that's the case. Even if it did, they're down in the substrate. They're pretty nocturnal, and there's enough of them that they can withstand a substantial amount of predation and still have a population to.
Because I know, if you have a farm pond or something with a feeder.
Yep.
The fish know when the feeder is due to go off. They're waiting for it, and as soon as the food hits the water.
Yeah, absolutely.
Chaos.
I think that has a lot to do with frequency. We only do it 3 times a week rather than 3 times a day, so I don't know if they get as used to it. Yes, sir.
Do you stock the eels in currently?
We do not. Once again, that's kind of out of our realm of control. That's the Corps' deal. They certainly don't want us up there. So once again, I can't speak to whether there's any plans for that or not, but nothing that we do.
Fritz,
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I know you spoke to it, but just to clarify, the reason why Dominion started working on this was it's now part of the FERC license.
Correct.
Is that correct?
Mm-hmm.
And FERC, along with these other agencies, mostly federal agencies, I assume, they decided that there was a need to help along with the American eel, just because it's not endangered, but it's threatened, I understand, due to the amount of obstructions, dams, et cetera, that have been put in our rivers over the last 50, 200 years.
Yeah, you know, for any migratory species, it's not hard to understand why dams might be an issue, right? So eels, we don't know a lot about them. It's kind of the one of the biggest reasons the agencies want to see us pay so much attention to them. We know there's less than there used to be. We don't have a great handle on how much less. But we do know that they're, you know, an important native animal here that we want to preserve. They play an important ecosystem role as scavengers and kind of the cleanup crew. And not so much around here, but in parts of the world there is a substantial commercial fishery for them, so that, which, you know, gives some anthropogenic value to them as well.
Is there any anticipation that as the American eel population increases, it will have an impact on the rest of the life cycle of other fish in the lake, the fishery?
Anything I say there would be speculation. I would say anytime you make a change that big to an ecosystem, something's going to change, right? That being said, I would expect, speculatively, that a rise in the eel population would benefit the ecosystem as a whole. They're such a good forage base and everything like that, you know. Yes, sir.
Obviously, the eels come up the Roanoke River to the Farmhouse Dam. And you mentioned earlier, just quickly, about some of the measurements at that dam. Tell us a little bit about what you do and how those results are showing. Because they've been coming there for many, many years before we put these passageways in.
Absolutely. So we do know that, you know, if there's a dam and there's fish passage, any migratory fish is going to stack up below that dam. Anybody that's fished for shad or stripers, you know, where do you find those in the spring? They're going to stack up at that barrier because they want to get further upstream, but they can't. And we definitely saw that in eels, sampling the bypass reach before we installed fish passage and stuff like that. Most of our work downstream of Roanoke Rapids does include eels, but hits a lot of the other anadromous species and the resident fish and the freshwater mussels. I'm going to get into that a little next. But does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Is there ever any plan for fish ladders for the stripers or whatever?
Not at this time. We've looked at that a lot with the differ tack. We've discussed it a lot of different ways. Basically, initially with the shad, they don't utilize like the lake habitat as well as the eels do. So if we were to move them with the shad and the herring, we would want to get them upstream of care as well. Joe Hightower out at NC State did a paper on that years ago, basically looking at that and concluded that it would be a detriment to the species at this point because it would be trap and transport. We'd probably be trucking them around dams. Any benefit the species would give would likely not be enough to offset the difficulty of them finding their way downstream. It is something, it's an open thing. There's not enough shad in the system to really justify a fish ladder right now, but it is something we talk about with our advisory committee every year. Just let's go back, let's take a look. Do we need to start talking about shad and Oligocines? So we don't do it now. There's no immediate plans to, just because of the state of that population. But it is something we keep in mind and, you know, could theoretically happen at some point. All right, so that kind of sums up the fish passage portion of it. Not that it doesn't play into the rest of it that we'll talk about. But this is more specific to Roanoke Rapids than Gaston, but as it's all part of the same system and it's a significant part of what we do, I figured I'd touch on it. What you see on this screen is the section of the Roanoke River just below Gaston. That nice clean bottom line you see is our tail race that comes out of our generation. All that braided stuff at the top is the bypass reach.
Hey, Fritz, just to be clear, this is below Rapids, not below Gaston.
Excuse me, that's correct. Thank you, Corey. So as you can see, that top portion was the original river channel that was bypassed when the tail race was built. It's extremely braided. There's multiple channels. I can tell you from experience, it's hard to get into. But we do go in there to make sure we know what's going on because it does provide good habitat for a lot of other critters. This is an extremely busy slide that's almost unreadable as I see it now, but I'll give you the gist of it anyway. This is a summary of our fish monitoring. So this is specifically for the resident fish, not the migratory fish we've been talking about so far, but everything from largemouth bass and crappie and bluegill all the way down to some of our smaller native darters and minnows and stuff like that we do care about a great deal. The point of this slide is to show that it's been fairly stable the last couple of years. We did see a significant uptick in the number of fish we catch there and the species right around 2016. And that's going to be a theme you see recurring throughout this. I was hoping you guys would be able to see a little better the kind of the list of fish we do encounter there. It's kind of interesting. There's a number of species, everything from game fish down to very fascinating little critters. But if anybody wants to talk with me about that later, I'm happy to tell you more about it. But you can go to the next slide. So this is our freshwater mussels. Some of you may have heard about freshwater mussels recently. There's been a lot of increased focus on them in the last several years in the ecological community as a whole, because of the ecosystem services we provide. A lot of people don't even know they exist. You know, they look like they're freshwater shellfish. They do a great deal of filtration. They're excellent indicators of water quality, and are some of all the texts in the world, freshwater mussels are some of the most imperiled and have the greatest number of species on the endangered and threatened species list. So we care a great deal about them for those reasons as well. The bars you see here are the actual numbers of mussels we collected in our different surveys. We do these surveys usually every 7 years. And the line is the number of species we've collected in our surveys. So once again, in our latest survey, you see a huge increase in the number of mussels we collected. And you'll notice that that came after that, you know, in between 2014 and 2021. Kind of in that same period, we saw an increase in fish. That huge increase in number was mostly due to one species. I believe it was the northern lance that we found a huge number of the last time we were out there compared to historically. But we also did see an uptick in the number of species we collected and a number of mussels of other species as well, which we love to see. Next slide, please. We also do anadromous fish, so those shad, striper, things like that that we've been talking about the whole time. Once again, these graphs are a little harder to read than I'd hoped. But what you see here is, and this is where I was going with that 2016 time period, is we've also been, for the last several years, we've been running experimental flows through the bypass. Historically, there was very little water going through there that provided very little habitat for anything to really thrive. In order to try and get it back to a more balanced and healthy ecological community, we've been running flow regimes for periods of years to kind of see how that affects the communities and the anadromous fish. What is the right level of water to be running through there to keep it healthy? And what we've seen reflected in these pictures, this is kind of separated into the three regimes we've looked at so far. You can see early on there was very little going on with the anadromous fish. That holds true for the mussels and resident fish as well. As soon as we turned that water on a little bit, everything changed. We saw a lot more of everything. The community's been looking great since then. We're currently looking at another increase since then, trying to tease out whether that has any additional benefit or not. Early results seem to show that there's not much benefit to increasing the water further, but we're still teasing out that data and talking with our advisory committee, as well as doing some additional sampling this year to make sure we get that decision right when we settle on a final level of flow we need to be sending through the bypass reach.
And I just want to, so many of you were around here when the Corps started their quasi-run-of-river, which was right in that 2016 timeframe. So whereas in the past we would have had very little in the way of flood flow going through that bypass reach area, after that we had some pretty substantial amounts of water flowing through there on random bases during flood periods. So that may have had an effect as well.
Absolutely. And these flows include kind of two components. There's the base flow that's always going through there. And then specifically for the anadromous species, we increase the flow for smaller periods of time to give those pulses of water through the system that those species really trigger off to make their upstream movements. The last thing we'll touch on, that's me back when I worked for a different agency. You may recognize the Virginia group. But we also do cooperate with the Lake Gaston Technical Advisory Group in helping with kind of the SAV control on Lake Gaston, specifically the hydrilla, but the grass carp aren't too picky about what they eat. We stock somewhere in the neighborhood of 8,000 grass carp a year, I believe, in different portions of the lake, especially during their younger years. They are voracious eaters of all aquatic vegetation, so they really help keep that grass down to a hopefully reasonable level. as they get to that size you see there, they do slow down, but they still keep pecking away at it. But that's why we stock them as often as we do, because those younger age class fish are much better at consuming that grass. I think that's it. Yeah. Any other questions?
So you're still stocking grass carp on a regular schedule?
Yes, sir. Corey, do you know exactly the schedule? I have not touched on that too much yet.
The tag meeting was just yesterday, and so the decision was made not to stock any shad this year. But last year we stocked, and then we'd stocked about 6 years before that.
Yeah.
There's been 1,000 fish were
Yeah,
stocked
last
last
year was-
year, and that
yeah.
was the first time in 6 years. So the overall hydrilla population is now in basically a controlled state, 300 acres or less, and monitoring the tuber bank and the hydrilla population we surveyed every year. Many of us in this room are volunteers in that process. So
Awesome.
we're pretty knowledgeable of it.
That's I think it's kind of the part of the process I'm still wrapping my head around the most. Yes, sir.
Did you find any zebra mussels when you were doing that survey?
We have not. Zebra mussels, luckily for us, require a pretty specific set of environmental circumstances. And luckily in Virginia, we just don't see those circumstances happen very much. So they haven't been a problem as far south as we are. Not to say they couldn't ever be, but happily, no, they haven't been an issue for us. We do have corbicula, which is an invasive species of freshwater clam that are a real problem for freshwater mussels. They're widespread pretty much everywhere. Not much we can do about it, but it is something that's there. Jeff?
The area that you were talking about, you did the mussel and the other fish survey in, you call it the passageway?
The bypass reach.
Bypass reach, okay. The water that's flowing down and going through the bypass reach, does that water go through the turbines?
It does not.
Turbines? So Dominion is letting that water flow along with QRR. We talked about that last year in the meeting here. That extra water allows that, and essentially your Dominion is bypassing the opportunity for the energy in order to improve that part of the reach and the overall ecosystem.
Yeah, that's correct. Obviously, like water is how we make power. We don't love sending a ton of it downstream without using it, but with the technical advisory committee, we've seen the effects it has. It's it is really helpful. So we happily continue to do it. Well, with that, thank you, everybody. Feel free to come find me after the meeting, or if you need email, I can give you my email. If you have further questions, feel free to reach out anytime. Happy to answer any questions you have.